Good morning, good evening, everyone, based on your time, John. Welcome back in Salesforce FXR. And today we are going to talk about how to overcome with the Salesforce Governor limit using the platform event. And today our speaker is Ohad. And my name is Amit Chaudhary. I'm the founder of the Salesforce FXR and the co-organizer of the Farm Intelligence Salesforce Developer Group. You can follow me on my Twitter handler, Amit_SFDC or FXRs. So we have an announcement for upcoming session. Can you move to the next slide, please?
Sure.
Yeah. So we have lots of upcoming sessions scheduled. So you just RSVP for that to get to know about those events, like introduction to the new mobile Salesforce mobile app and the microservice in Salesforce. Dates are mentioned over here. If you want to know about more, just go to the FXR's website and you can know about it. And one more big announcement we are doing, like we are doing the virtual dreaming on the May 16 and 17. It's a free event. 3 different tracks will be parallelly running on Apex Admin, Developer, and Architect. If you want to learn more, just visit to the virtual dreaming website and register for that. And guys, it's totally free. So I will not take more time here. So let me hand over to Ohad.
Thank you, Amit. So good morning or evening, everyone, wherever you are around the world. My name is Ohad Idan, and I am a Salesforce guy, I guess you can call me. I've been a Salesforce MVP since 2017, but really working with the platform since 2010, so basically about 10 years now. I recently moved to Richmond, Virginia, from the New York area. So in New York, I was the New York City co-leader for the developer user group. And when I moved down here to Richmond, joined the leadership here. So I'm a co-leader in Richmond, Virginia now. About 3 years ago, I also founded Praxis Solutions. We are a Salesforce consulting organization. We do everything from implementation, development, customization, integration, all these other fun stuff. And it's been a lot of fun. I've got 8 certifications, and beyond all that, I'm married. I have a beautiful daughter, and really, I guess you can call me a nerd. I really love to follow technology and everything technology. So that's me, and let's just jump right in. So we're here today to talk about a very specific use case of using relatively new technology on the Salesforce platform called platform events. I'm saying relatively new because it's probably about almost 3 years old by now since it was initially released. But like everything Salesforce, it took time to actually get released and get some of the kinks out. And still, I find that many people don't really know about it, or even if they know about it, they don't know what they can do with it or why they should use it. So we'll touch on some of these things today. We'll talk about what governor limits are. We'll talk about synchronous versus asynchronous processing. If people on this group are on this session right now are developers, then I would expect these are all topics that are familiar to you, but we'll kind of just make sure we go over them and make sure we use the same language. We'll talk about platform events. We'll introduce them and see what they are. And then we'll talk about some of the considerations. What are some of the things you should know when you want to use platform events? And then we'll just look at a couple of examples of how to use platform events to get over some of the governor limits. And finally, I'll just mention some other use cases that I've personally got to use platform events to solve some cool problems. And we'll end with that. So with that, let's just get started. So we all live on this beautiful blue marble. You might have heard of it. It's called Earth. And on this planet, we have limited resources. And we all know that in order to keep this planet alive and the environment safe, we all need to be careful about how we use those resources. We need to make sure we don't overuse resources. And the challenge is that, you know, while some people are very good at limiting their resource use, some people are less good at that. And some people may be greedy and say that if I use more resources, I can make a lot of money. So what do we do in the world to make sure that people don't overuse resources, or at least we try? Governments or other organizations try to put rules and regulations about how much resources you can use how you can use them, and so on. And so if we take this analogy of planet Earth and we look at it in the Salesforce world where we all live, we also have limited resources, right? Computers have CPUs, they have hard drives, they have power restrictions and all these things. And those are resources that it's up to Salesforce to manage, and it's up to Salesforce to make sure that people don't abuse them. Because one person abusing these resources would mean a lesser experience for all the other users that share those resources. We know that Salesforce is what we call a multi-tenant architecture, which means that one server with one set of resources is actually shared by many, many, many different customers. And that makes this need to restrict how people use those resources extremely important for Salesforce. So some of the governor limits you may all know. CPU time is one of them, right? How much time off the CPU we can consume when we perform transactions in our system. Another one you may know is our too many SOQLs, sorry, statement, right? So we know that we have a limit on how many SOQL queries we're allowed to execute in a given transaction. And the reason for that is that executing a SOQL query requires the computer to access the hard drive. Hard drives are, unfortunately, the slowest thing in a computer. And so when you do a lot of queries, you access the hard drive often, you consume its resources, and you take more time to run your program. So if you write code that is more efficient in its use, you might have code that runs better. Another example of a governor limits are mixed DMLs. In the Salesforce world, a lot of those mixed DMLs have been actually eliminated over the years, but there are still some things that you cannot do together. An example for that is code that attempts to update data. Data could be an account, an opportunity, a contact, and at the same time attempts to update some metadata. So this metadata could be a public group membership. Some of the user attributes like roles cannot be updated together with any of those. So if you try to update an account or have a trigger that updates an account and then update also, let's say, a public group membership, you'll get this mixed DML governor limit exception. So one of the side effects of these governor limits in actuality is actually a good side effect, because it forces us developers or even admins to think about how we can write code, how we can create programs that use those resources in the most efficient manner. And when you think about writing code in that way, you inherently become a better programmer. You write better code, you write more efficient code, and you write more organized code. So that is all wonderful and great, but if you've been working with the platform for any given amount of time, any meaningful amount of time, you probably know that sometimes those governor limits are just annoying, right? You get it, you try to do something, you hit a governor limit, you're like, why? I'm just trying to do something that I need to do. Salesforce just recognized that I'm doing my best. My code is efficient as it can be, but I still can't get around this governor limit. So over the years, Salesforce has introduced many different things. When you hit one of those walls, right, one of these limits, Salesforce has introduced different technologies that allow us to get around them and completely be able to complete what we want to do in different ways. So until today, if you have never used platform events, the solution is typically to go asynchronous. So when we talk about asynchronous processing, we talk about things like queuables, we talk about futures, and hopefully nobody's really using future methods anymore. We talk about batch, and bear with me, you try to find a picture that represents batch, so I just found a batch of cookies. And of course, we talk about time-based workflows. So all of these different technologies allow us to basically say, okay, at some point, I know I can't do everything I need to do within this synchronous context of my execution. So I'm going to go and use an asynchronous context, something that runs the rest of the code or all of my code behind the scenes in a background scenario. Because Salesforce is able to control when those asynchronous processes are executed, they also say we can make sure that you have more resources available to you. So CPU time, for example, in a synchronous context, you have 10 seconds of CPU time. If you use the CPU, in other words, if your program runs for more than 10 seconds, you will get an exception, a governor limit exception. However, in an asynchronous process, you get 60 seconds. You get more SOQL and more DMLs, as well as some other things when you talk about web services, for example. So those have been how we typically get around some of these limits. So I've been talking about synchronous versus asynchronous, assuming, again, everybody has already a good understanding of what that means. But let's just look at it again, high level. So what is a synchronous execution? When we talk about synchronous execution, we talk about a transaction that starts when a user clicks, let's say from the user interface, a user clicks save on a new account page. When they click save, Salesforce has what we call the order of execution. The order at which triggers run, before triggers, after triggers, workflow rules, validation rule, assignment rules, and so on. All of these are what we call the synchronous execution context. And this context ends when all of these steps are completed. And when the steps are completed, the Salesforce will basically refresh the page and show you the end result. So of course, if you have any trigger that changes the data that was just entered by the user, when the page loads, you'll see that the data is already modified because the trigger has completed executing. So all of this thing that we see from the point that the user clicks save until the page reloads is what we consider this one single synchronous execution context. If anything is unclear about it, or if you need any clarification, please feel free to ask any questions during what we talk. If we talk about using asynchronous in the same context, right? So let's say that we have something really complex we need to do when a user clicks save on a new account. So we can have a trigger on the account, and the trigger will then, let's say, enqueue a queuable job. So while this all of the codes gets executed, the page gets reloaded before all of this work is completed. So in other words, the user clicks save, trigger workflows, all this gets completed quickly. And then you also put a job back in the queue to get executed to do more work. And this other work will only be available to see after this job has been completed. And what happens is, of course, when you enqueue a queuable job, depending on the server load and depending on how much other stuff you have in your org, this queuable can start immediately or really within seconds. And sometimes in more probably rare scenarios, you might see a queuable sitting in the queue for a minute, or even again, in really rare scenarios, even more than a minute before it actually starts executing. But what that means is that if you're trying to update any data that relates to this account directly, you basically need to tell your user, hey, there's some stuff that's going to happen in a moment. You'll have to refresh your page to see when it's done, or maybe we'll send you an email when this processing is done, or a custom notification or something. But in essence, it creates a gap between what the user expects to see and when they can actually expect to see this. Okay, so what if there was another way? And this is kind of what we had to talk about. So this little flow chart seems very similar to what we looked before. However, in this case, instead of talking about enqueuing a job, we'll talk about publishing a platform event. Platform events are another way to execute code asynchronously. When you publish a platform event, and let's say you have a trigger that listens to this platform event, that trigger will execute in a completely separate execution context, which means, in essence, it allows you to do things in addition to what happens in your synchronous execution context. One of the differences is that publish events don't have any kind of queuing mechanism, meaning as soon as you publish a platform event, it will immediately start processing it. In fact, sometimes it happens so fast that it can even complete before the page reloads. Now, I'm trying to illustrate here that this could happen, that the event completes before the page reloads, but in honesty, and it's not really guaranteed, right? Depending on what you do in your platform event processing, and depending on a few other factors that we'll discuss in a moment, this may not actually be true. It may not actually complete before the page loads, but it could happen. And depending on how you design your solution, that could be a way for you to solve one of these challenges. Okay, so of course, we have a wonderful developer looking up and saying, thank God, you've given me something new. So let's talk about what platform events really are. So I like to say platform events are like a superpower you didn't even know you had. And the reason for that is because you can actually do really a lot of different things with platform events. And you can use them in many, many different ways. But let's look at some of the differences between S objects and platform events. So the first difference in S object, of course, being any custom object or standard object, be it an account, contact, or whatever custom object you may have created. When you want to create a new S object, you can use insert, you can use an update, you can use a delete DMLs to create, modify, or delete these records. In a platform event world, you cannot do any kind of update, you cannot do any kind of delete. Instead, you can only do an insert. And this insert is actually not it's not a true DML operation, but rather it's what we call a publish. However, having said that, it does count toward your DML governor limits. So you do it in a different way. You don't call the database.insert, or you don't call insert this platform event. You actually have to use something called publish, and we'll talk about that, and we'll look at that in a moment. With S objects, if you want to see what data is in your system, you can use SOQL to query that. You can use a select statement to say, get me all these accounts where the owner is Ohad. In platform events, you can't actually use SOQL to query them, but rather you use something called the streaming API. And we're not going to go into a lot of details about what the streaming API is, but suffice it to say that platform events are really, if you think about it, it's a stream of events that happen. And in essence, you kind of get them as they occur. And you can always say, hey, go back in time and give me events from a certain point in time. So you do have the ability to kind of get old events, but events are not designed to be persistent data. You wouldn't use an event to store information about a person, about something that happened in your organization. An event rather is, hey, something happened in my organization, in my environment, and I need to do something because of that. And for that reason, events typically are only stored for 24 hours. Actually, I may be wrong about that time, but events are stored only for a limited amount of time. And we do have a question here. How do you debug an asynchronous job? So that's a really good question. And we have another question. So if platform events doesn't complete, then manual refresh is the only way to see the updated data. So I'll answer that first. Yes. Just like anything else, if you have any other asynchronous process, you'd have to refresh the page to see any changes to the data that happened. And in fact, you know that if the platform event updated the data behind the scene and somebody tries to edit the record, they will get the error that says this record has been modified since you last loaded this page. Please reload the page before you make changes. Tilak is asking, is it similar to CDC, change data capture? And the answer to that is yes. Actually, change data capture is a type of platform event. It's exactly the same. The only difference is that the CDC, a change data capture, is a type of platform event that fires automatically. You don't need to publish it. Salesforce will publish it, and it will include a certain set of fields that already have been predefined by Salesforce. And so I'll go back to Deepak's questions about how do you debug. You debug an asynchronous process just like you debug any other thing in Salesforce, right? You can use the developer console or any of the, let's say, VS Code to get your debug logs and be able to get your debug log and debug what's happened in asynchronous. So if you use a queuable, if you use a batch, if you use a future method, they will all generate debug logs. And platform events, code that executes on platform events will do the same thing. However, there is a caveat. We'll talk about that in a moment. Another question from Chandra. If platform events are not persistent beyond the time interval, that could introduce challenges, right? So not really. Because again, the idea is you don't actually ever query your events to see, hey, what happened in your organization, but rather you listen to them and you act on them as they happen. So the idea is you would never, it's not designed so you would go back and see, hey, what happened, 2 weeks ago. However, there are some retention of the platform event. As I said, I don't remember exactly, but it's 24 hours, maybe 72. I don't remember. We can find that out quickly. Because if you do have, let's say, a missed event, if a system is down or whatever, if you use integration using the streaming API to query events, and maybe the integration is broken for whatever reason, you're able to go and say, hey, get me the events from a certain period of time. But the expectation is that, it's not going to be a week or 2 weeks or whatever. It's going to be something that's relatively recent. Okay, I'm going to try and answer a couple more questions, and then we'll continue with the presentation, and we can keep answering more questions toward the end. Traced entity is automated process. I'm not sure what you mean by traced entity, but yes, automated process is the user. Okay, yes, that is the user that will execute everything on the platform event. So whenever you have a platform event, and that's what I actually was referring to earlier, there's a little difference in how you debug, because when you have a user that saves a record, you know that the debug log will show as this user's executed it. So if you trace that user, you'll be able to see the debug log. The same with any queuable and batch and future that user causes to get launched, they will be appearing as the executing user is the user who caused the batch to be scheduled or the queuable to be queued. However, with platform events, the user that executes it is always going to be this automated process user, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Amy says concurrent client limit is there for platform events. I remember it was 2,000 for unlimited editions. There is a limit on how many systems can subscribe to a platform event. We'll talk about that maybe towards the end if we have some time. And I think that's it for now. So back to our comparison. So we talked about SOQL and streaming API. We'll talk about trigger. So in an S-object world, if you want to have something that acts on a change in an S-object, or when an insert, an update, or delete happens, you would write a trigger. Or of course, you can use platform process builders, workflow rules, and flows. However, in a platform event, you actually have what you call a subscriber. A process builder that listens to an event is a subscriber to an event. A trigger that is listening to a change on an event is a subscriber. You can also have external subscribers using a technology called, wow, I'm completely blanking out for a second. I'll remember in a second. But you can you can have external subscriber using APIs to subscribe to a system. It's a long polling technology. And in S-objects, you have what we call a parallel context execution. What do I mean by that? If I am in the system and Amit is in the same system, we're both in the same environment. If I click save on a new account and Amit at exactly the same time clicks save on another account, what happens is you actually have two parallel execution of the same trigger. One executed as Amit, one executed as Ohad, and they can both complete around the same time. Of course, then you need to start worrying about things like record locking and so on. But you could have the same trigger executing multiple times at the same time. With platform event, that cannot happen. Platform events have something called guaranteed order of execution. And that means that if Amit publishes a platform event and I publish a platform event at around the same time, whoever published the platform event first gets into the queue first. Whoever publishes second gets into the queue second, and so on. Every event gets executed, published in an order. And your trigger on that platform event will execute them in the right order. So theoretically, when I was talking about this kind of thing where we can use this to complete the platform event before the page loads, it also depends on how many platform events are actually published. Because if you have 10,000 users and everybody is doing it at the same time, everybody clicking save and it publishes an event at the same time, well, now you have 10,000 events and they all have to execute before it gets to the 999th person's event to process. So in that scenario, you could definitely have a scenario where the event completes somewhere down here after the page reloads. Okay, so those are some of the main differences between platform events and S-objects. There are some other, but for now, we'll stick with those. So how do we create a platform event? Platform events are created through the setup menu. And in fact, why don't we take a look at that? Let's go to the setup menu. Sorry, I'm already here. So in the setup menu, you'll search for platform events. Oh, look at that, they're right here. And this is where you can create a new type of platform event. In that sense, a platform event is almost like an S object. However, it's much more limited in some ways. So we'll give it a name, my event. It will get an API name. We'll give it a description. These are events that belong to me. And now, before I jump back into what the rest means, let's look at some, actually, you know what, let's do this. One of this really important and interesting thing, well, first of all, let's talk about event type. You see right now that I can only select high volume. So when platform events were introduced, there was something called standard platform events. Then Salesforce introduced high volume platform events, and then they actually sunsetted the standard platform events. So today, any platform event that you create is by necessity, by definition, high volume platform events. And what it really means to you, what it really means behind the scene, it doesn't really matter. What it really means to you is that you have higher limits on what you can do with the platform events. You can process more events in a given amount of time. Behind the scenes, it's actually two different technologies that were running those platform events, but we don't really care about that. What we do care about is this publish behavior, publish after commit or publish immediately. Let's hold off a second to talk about what that means. Once I created my platform event, you can see that there are, just like any custom object that we create in Salesforce, it has, you know, the name, the created by, created date, last modified by, last modified date on any standard object. However, on a platform event, there are different, I mean, we know the created by, created date are here, but we don't have last modified because we said platform events cannot be updated after they were created. And at the same time, we also have something called replay ID. So replay ID is kind of like the Salesforce record ID, but it's called a replay ID because this is what you would use to then be able to use the streaming API and say, hey, go back in time to the event that started after this one event. So I won't go into much more detail here, but sorry, my phone just thought I called Google. But those are the three standard fields, and then we can create additional custom fields. However, you can see that the type of fields we can create here are much more limited. We can't create pick list, we can create lookups, and you know, obviously there's a very restricted set of fields that you can create here. But I can just as easily create a text field, and I can call this whatever, calling record ID. And I could pass a record ID, and I'll just restrict it to 18 characters. And maybe this is required because I can't really execute my event without this. So this is how we define a platform event. It's not very complicated, just like an S object, just some things to know about the differences. Amy says, batch will certainly, okay, so there were a couple of things here, looks like I missed. So I'm just reading back on some of the questions. What I have experienced is it can act within Salesforce context. I think I may be missing here some things. Okay, there's some more conversation here. Okay, this is the last I read. So is it possible to use with REST callout? This is a really good question. The short answer is no. The long answer is yes. Not only because it has more letters, but also because there is a workaround that you can use to create REST, to call REST from platform event. But because platform event actually rely on the trigger framework, today it is not possible. The trigger framework does not allow REST callouts from the trigger. However, that is a limit that's not actually a limit on the platform event. It's just a limit on the framework that the triggers use. And Salesforce has, and this is completely safe harbor kind of statement, Salesforce is planning to make some changes to the trigger framework to allow REST callouts from platform event triggers. However, that is coming. There is a way around it, however. So if we get to the end, ask that question again, and I'll maybe get to say how we can actually do that. Another question, what I experience is it can act within Salesforce context. I don't think it can replace callouts. Yep, so that's exactly what we were talking about. Is async trigger same as PE? So what is async trigger? I'm not sure what async trigger is. So Danish, if you want to tell me what you meant by that, let me know. Is this scenario better to create a batch? So, I mean, I don't know what scenario, but batches, you know, they have their own great things about them and their own limitations, right? You can only have 5 batches executing in a given moment in an org, across the entire org, right? So across all of your solutions, you can only have 5 batches that are executing at the same time. What do you do if platform event publish failed? So the publish, if it failed, you'll get an exception, just like you do when you try to insert a record that you couldn't insert because maybe a required field was not included. However, if the execution fails, public platform events have built-in retries, and then you can have those ways, those patterns that we can use to execute even beyond the standard retry. But we'll keep that for now. That's outside of the scope of what we'll talk about. Can you invoke any API or execute JavaScript code from platform event? Not really. And we'll live by that. So, oops, what did I just do? I think I accidentally clicked the link. Okay. So going back to our presentation. So we looked at those fields already. So let's go back to this publish behavior, publish immediately versus publish after commit. So to understand what this actually means, let's look at a sample of code because it probably will be a little bit easier to understand. Let's say that we have a trigger on the account object, okay? And the trigger has a method that does something, and, oh, I'm sorry, this is just a test scenario. So in this code, we actually insert an account, right? We created a new account, and then we inserted it, right? So the first thing we do is a DML to insert the account. And then you see that after I do the insert, I create a publish platform event, and I use the event bus.publish to publish this platform event. So typically what you'd expect is that this event now has a trigger on it, and the trigger the trigger on a platform event is always after insert. There's no before insert. I don't think there's before insert. There's always after insert. There's definitely not update, and there's no delete because you cannot update and delete a platform event. In this scenario, I'm going to try and query for this account that was just created in the code above us. And then I'm going to assert that the account side equals to 1, meaning I got the account that I needed. When we think about this, we say, hey, this platform event was published after the record was created, so I should be able to query that account. However, in reality, platform events are executing, as I said, in a separate context, and they can execute very, very quickly. So what you could have happen is that this platform event actually executes before the database completed saving this account. So even though in our code, we see that this event is published after this account, when the code executes on this event, the account may not actually exist. So this is something that's a little hard to replicate. If I'll try to actually run this code right now, we may or may not see this happening. Again, it depends on kind of what's happening, what else is happening in your org and in your platform event specifically. But I've had real scenarios where I wanted to use platform events to do something on data that was either created or updated in code. I published an event, and then the event could not see the data that was created or modified because it just didn't finish saving before the transaction published. So because of that problem, Salesforce later introduced this capability. This wasn't there when platform events were initially released, but they did introduce this capability to say, hey, I want to publish it immediately. And this would be a scenario where I don't really need to rely on data that was created or updated in my current context. But if I need to just, let's say, oh, when this happens, let me go and do something completely unrelated, I will use publish immediately. However, if I want to rely on data that was created or updated in my code or in my context that published the event, I would want to use the publish after commit, publish behavior. So hopefully this is clear. This is something that's obviously very new to platform event. That was not something that ever had to be considered as something you would even need to think about with S objects. Okay, if there's no questions about that, Okay, we looked at those. And let's talk about some other considerations. So even though platform event, I called them an asynchronous process because they get executed in a separate process than the process that was executing it. However, even though it's in that context, or in that term, it's asynchronous, it's happening separately from the context that launched it, they do not have the asynchronous governor limits. So you do not get that additional CPU time, you do not get that additional DMLs and SOQL queries, and you do not get anything else that comes with asynchronous. So that's a really important consideration, right? If you want to use platform event for something, why is my phone continuing to think I call it? If you do think about using platform event to do something more complex, you have to really be aware that you don't get the 60 seconds of CPU, you still only get the 10 seconds of CPU. Another consideration, so in a trigger, we have all been working with triggers for years, and we know that a trigger has to be bulkified because trigger can have up to 200 records grouped in a single trigger execution, right? So you know that you have to use trigger.new, which is a list of records, and you know that you can use the map of records and all that, new map. However, the triggers in a platform event can hold up to 2,000 events in the trigger.new list or collection. So again, if we talk about those limits, you actually could be in a place where you need to execute a lot more events, and you have, only synchronous limits in terms of what you can do. So that's, again, another important consideration for deciding to use platform events. However, and this is something that, again, wasn't there when Salesforce initially introduced platform events, but Salesforce introduced this to allow us to do some really cool stuff. With platform events, you have the ability to control this transaction size. So I said just now that there's 2,000 records per event, but what if you know that for each event that comes in, you will have to do significant amount of processing. And there's just no way you can process 2,000 events in a single synchronous context. Salesforce gives you this thing called resume checkpoint. So let's say I just published 10 platform events. Each platform event gets its own replay ID. I can actually loop through them. And when I get, let's say I can only execute one at a time. In the loop, I can set the resume checkpoint to the replay ID that I want to resume from. And what Salesforce will do, it will break that context and will start a brand new context starting from that point. So while you do have the ability to process up to 2,000 events in a single trigger context, you also have the ability to really have this size, any size you want, or even have it dynamic. You could say, you can have a loop that checks the limits, how many SOQL you've already used, and then when you reach a certain number of limits, you can then break this context and start with a new context. So it's a really, really cool feature that allows us to do really cool stuff again with platform events. Let me see if there's any other questions. So Naresh says, sorry, I'm lost. What is the use of using platform events if we don't get extra CPU time? We can do it synchronously, right? Well, think about it. First of all, you could do things synchronously and do more things in a platform event. So you can do more than you would have done in a platform event. In a single synchronous execution, you can basically do twice as much, right? That's one thing. But sometimes there's just things that you can't do, and we'll actually talk about that in a moment. So Naresh, that's a really good question, and that exactly is why we are here today. Okay, so we're actually at 42 minutes in, so I'm going to try and get through this a little faster. Let's roll up sleeve and take a look at a couple of scenarios. So this is the first scenario we look at. We have John. John is a Salesforce administrator, so he only uses declarative stuff. And he wants to use Salesforce to obtain and track approvals for user role changes. So every time a manager comes and say, hey, I need to change the role for, for this person from X to Y, they can track these and have approvals. So when a request for role changes approval, he wants the role to automatically be updated to the related user. sorry. So let's look at what this thing could look like. So John created this object. This object is called role change request, and it has an approval status. It has approval status. It has the new role. It has the current role, and the user that we want to update the role for. So sorry, let's take a look at this. And actually, I should have done something before this call, before this started. So let me just take a look at Luke for a second, really quick. So we'll look at Luke's record, and let's update him real quick. Right now, he is a Jedi Knight. So let's take Luke and change him from a Jedi Knight into a youngling. He is right now the earliest level of Jedi that can be. We can now create a new change request and select Luke as our user that we want to track a request for. It's not submitted. The new role we want him to have is Padawan, and we'll save it. So now we can build an approval process on this, and we can track this submission. Now, of course, if John wants the role to automatically be updated, then he needs to create something like a process builder. So let's look at the process builder that John created. He has a process builder that looks at this object we just created when a record is updated and edited. And he says if the role is equals to approved, then let's just update this user and set the role ID to the new role that was defined on the role request. And this process builder is now active. So if I try to update this and change this to approved, we would expect the user role to change. However, we get an error that says we can't save this record because the process failed. What is the reason it failed? We got a mixed DML operation. We are not able to update a record and the role on a user at the same time. So how would we tackle this? We can, of course, create a queuable. We can create a future method. We can create time-based action in a process builder. However, let's see if we can use platform events for this. So I'm going to go ahead and deactivate this process builder. And let's look at our platform events. John created a new platform event called user role update. And he only created two fields on it. One is the role ID and one is the user ID. Who is the user that we want to change and what role do we want to change to? And you can see that this has publish immediately because we can update the user immediately. We don't have to look at the role request to the updated values on the role request in order to execute this. So once he created this platform event, he had to create two more process builders. The first process builder will publish this event. So again, we have a listening to the same object, the role change request. We have the same thing when it's approved, but now instead of updating the user, we are publishing a platform event. And we're publishing event of the user role update event, and we are passing the role ID and the user ID that we need to change for. And we get them from the record that came in. And then we build another process builder. This process builder is a subscriber to our platform event. It listens to this platform event. And you can see that when I do that, I get to select the platform event and the object that I want to work with. In this case, I can say the user ID on the platform event equals to, the user ID in the object will equal to the event user ID. So we can get the user ID and work with it without having to do any querying. It will always execute whenever an event is published, and all we're doing is updating the role ID on this user. So we were able to do exactly the same thing, but we had to break it into publish an event, create the event, publish the event, and then do something when the event is published. Let me activate this process builder as well, and this one as well. And if I go to this role request now, and I try to do exactly the same, remember we deactivated the initial one. We now updated this to approved, and when I save, no problem saving. And if I go back to look as the user, it was youngling, and when I refresh the page, he is now a Padawan. So that's one way to get around mixed DMLs by doing this kind of thing. Okay, hopefully that was pretty clear. I know I went through this very quickly. I'm just trying to be cognizant of the time. Amit, do we have a hard stop at 11, or is it typically okay if we go a few minutes over?
We can, usually it will be 60 to 90 minutes, so you have 30 more extra
Oh,
minutes.
okay. So I don't have to rush. Sounds good. Okay, so with that, because I did kind of rush to that, I want to ask, is that clear? Are there any questions about what I just described? I like it. I don't see any question. Some of you may be typing, but you know, we were just able to really get around this mixed DML, and we didn't need to use time-based action, which could again take a minute or more to execute. We didn't have to use queuables or batches, which require us to write code, and also could take, you know, seconds or minutes to execute. So I see people say this was a nice example. It's clear, so great. Let's keep going with this. So back to our presentation. Let's look at another use case. So now we have the same problem, but in Apex code. Okay, let's see how the same kind of thing would be accomplished with Apex. So here we have Jennifer. Jennifer is a developer, and she was tasked in creating code that, again, when the same record is approved, we do not only update the role, but we also want to add that user to a public group with the same name as the new role, and then remove them from the public group with their old role name. So you may or may not know that group membership is something that cannot be created with declarative tools. You can't use process builder to create group membership. But in order to add somebody to a public group, all we need to do is create a record of a standard object called group membership. So let's look how Jennifer would tackle this problem. First of all, let's take a look at our public groups. So we've created some public groups here. And because I first updated look manually, let's take a look here. We have our Youngling, our Padawan, our Jedi Master, and Jedi Knight group. And let's see where Luke is right now. He might be in the Jedi Knight because that's where he was when we started today. And he is here right now. So I'm actually going to remove Luke from this group manually. And because we updated his user to a Padawan, let's add him to the Padawan group. In fact, you know, this may have been the process before Jennifer was asked. Maybe somebody, whenever the role was updated, somebody had to go remove him from his Youngling group and add him to the Padawan group, right? But now we want to automate that. So I'm going to go here and add Luke to a Padawan. That would have been our manual process. And so now Jennifer wants to automate that. So Jennifer knows that this user role update platform event exists. And she knows that John built it to handle those exact scenarios. And she says, I can probably rely on the same platform event to do what I need to do. Whenever it's approved, I'm going to use the same platform event to remove the group membership and add a group membership. So let's take a look at our developer console. So first of all, let's, actually, I'm sorry. I apologize, I misspoke. Jennifer actually ended up creating her own platform event. And this one is called group membership platform event. So here, she has the same kind of platform event with the user ID being passed, but this time she wants to know if the group, what is the group name? What group do we need to add the user to? And she also has a thing called type. And the type will, you know, it's a text because we don't have really platform event, pick lists, sorry. She says it's required, and in the description, she says the type of platform event must be one of group add or group remove. So she can use the same platform event to remove the user from the old group and to add the user to a new group. One of the other things that we can, okay, before I get into that, let's look at what Jennifer has done. So the first thing she's done is actually create a platform event. The publishing of this platform event can happen from a process builder. She didn't need to write a trigger to publish it, even though she just as well could have. So the same thing, we have the same type of process builder when it's created or edited, when it's approved. However, this time, Jennifer does a couple of different things. First of all, she kept what John had. So this is the platform event for user role update. And then this is the publishing of that event. And then she also publishes a new event called group membership. And she has the type as group remove. This is hard coded. And the group name is the current role for the user. You can see the user role.name. It's actually a formula that tells us what is the current role of the user. So before it was updated, this is the role that he had. So we would want to remove him from Padawan. And of course, the user ID. And immediately, she also posts another event called group add. And in this time, the group name is going to be the new role name. So in this case, it could be the Jedi Knight. Okay? So her platform event replaces, her process builder, I apologize. Her process builder that does these three things replaces the process builder that John created to publish this platform event. So we can deactivate this one. However, we probably want to keep this platform event that actually updates the role on the user. And we'll activate this one as well. So now let's look at the trigger that listens to this platform event that was just published. So again, going to the developer console. Let me close this and show. If we go to open, we can see that on our triggers, we actually have the group membership event trigger. And so this group membership event trigger, we're not going to go through all of it. We'll just go through some of the critical things. We can see its group membership event trigger on group membership, and platform events are using the suffix __ E. So unlike custom objects, we would use __ C, platform events have __ E. However, any field, custom field inside that will still use the __ C. And you can see, of course, the event is always after insert, as I mentioned. So we'll do a bunch of things here. I created a list of, this is fully bulkified, so there's a lot of overhead here around the bulkification. But I have a group of members that we would need to add. A group of members we'll need to delete. So if there's a bunch of events happening at the same time, we might have many members we need to insert as new memberships, a bunch of members that we need to delete the old group memberships. And then we have a map that we use with group name to user ID to member ID. So it's actually a map of string to a map of ID to group member. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here. All of this code is available on a GitHub repo that I'll share with you at the end of this presentation. So feel free to look at what was done here. In any case, we now go through all of these events, and we add all the group names into a set. We want it to be a set because we only want to get a unique set of all the groups that we want to care about. And then we create some other maps, and for each group in this select statement, right? So let's query all the groups that we found here, all the unique groups that were published, and for each one of them, we will add the group ID by name and the group name by ID. So I want to be able to look at the name and get the ID. I want to be able to look at the ID and get the name. So now I basically just got all of these groups. So I got a unique set of groups from all of my events. I got all of their IDs and built two maps, one that will allow me to get the ID by name and one that will allow me to get the name by ID. And then now I actually start the work. So I go through and look at all the existing group members. So I go and I look at group member, M. Group member is the membership record. And I select all the group members and I say, get all the members where the group ID is in this set of groups that I just got. So it's the group name by ID map.keyset. So actually, does that make sense? Yes, actually, yes, by ID. So the ID is the key. And so I get the key set and I get all the members of all of these groups that just came up. And then as I iterate it, I say, if this map that I built earlier, wait, let's see what I do here. Okay, so basically I say I have again, I'm trying to skip this high level, but in essence, I'm saying, hey, if I already know that this group member contains this group ID, then I know that I need to, let's see what I do here. It's been a little bit while since I wrote this code, so give me a second. This is a group name, to user ID, to member ID. So I see if this group name already has this group in it as the first key. So the first key of the outer map is the group ID. Then I put this user in as the user ID to member ID. So now in the group Padawan, this is a key, and inside the value, I have another map that could have in it the user ID and the group membership that belongs to that user ID. And then if it doesn't exist, then I create a new external grouping and add the same thing. So this is just a scenario, a pattern that we use to say, if the map already has a key, then just add a new member to that, to the new value to that key. Otherwise, create the key and the value for it. Hopefully that's not too complex. If you ever used maps of maps, it should be pretty clear. If not, you might want to spend a few more minutes going through this. And now finally, now that I've built all of my maps, I know all my groups, I know all my users, and I know all my user memberships to these groups. Now I can start to look at the events that were published. And now I basically say, again, iterate through all of these events, and I can say, if this event that I'm looking at now is a group add, and this in essence just say that this group, that the user has a membership to this group, or, I'm sorry, this is a group add, I'm sorry, and the username does not already have membership to this group, or I'm trying to remember what I did here. And group name, oh, so this is just to handle a null scenario, but basically we say if it's a group add and the user doesn't already have a group membership for this group, then we'll create a new record of group member, we'll assign the group ID from the map that we have, and we'll assign the user ID from the map that we have, and we'll add it to a list of new members that we'll need to add. And then if it's a group remove and the user exists, this time we only want to delete it if it exists, then we will add the group membership to this members to delete. So in essence, all we've done here, and I know this is slightly complex, but all we've done here is we got all the unique groups, we built a bunch of maps with those groups, we got all the members for those groups and we organized them by members of a given group, and within that given group, all the user IDs and the group membership IDs. And then we say if it's a group add, if we are, and then we iterate through all the events, we say if it's a group add and the user doesn't already have a membership to this group, let's create a new membership. And if it's a group remove and the user has a membership, we'll add it to a list of groups to remove, group memberships to remove. And then finally, at the end of all this, we can say if there are members to add, let's insert them. If there are members to delete, let's delete them. Keep in mind again, this is something we couldn't do synchronously because we are not allowed to add group memberships in the same transaction as regular data. We would get the mixed DML if we try to do this in just as a trigger on the role request object. So again, I know I kind of ran through this. Some question, can we publish to platform event deleted records? You could have an on delete trigger on a record that will publish to a platform event. Yes, if that's the question. Oh, and I see already a response. And can we generate a PDF based on object data in LWC? So I'm not sure I understand that. You could use platform event to generate a PDF, absolutely. You could also use platform events with LWC. This is outside the scope of what we're going to talk about today, but you actually can use platform events to let Lightning Web Components know that something happened in the database. So you can actually create pages that update the page automatically and dynamically when something changes on the database. But that's absolutely outside of the scope of what we're doing, talking about today. Okay. Can you explain? I can't explain the PDF generation just because we don't have much time. But I'm happy to talk about that separately. You can always contact me outside of this. I'll share my contact information again at the end of the presentation. Okay, so this trigger is there. We activated a process builder that publishes these two events. And let's look what happens now when we create a new role request. And now we want to update Luke Skywalker from the last one we did, we updated him into a Padawan. So let's update Luke Skywalker now from a Padawan. Oops, not that guy. To Jedi Knight. And if I save this, we can see his current role is Padawan, and that's what will pass actually to the platform event as the group to remove him from, and then we'll pass the new role name as the group to add him to. So when I try to update to submitted, this platform event will then publish, I'm sorry, not to submitted, to approve. This platform event will publish this process builder will publish 3 platform events. One to update the role on the user record, one to remove him from the Padawan group, and one to add him to the Jedi Knight group. And we'll actually be able to look at the log for that as well. Well, actually, we won't. I need to do something in order to see this. So this is actually one of the things I started to mention earlier. Platform events always execute as this process automation user. So if I want to be able to see the log, I have to put a tracing on automated process. So oops, I didn't mean to delete it, but I did. So let's create a new one. When we want to trace it, the user entity type has to actually be automated process. And we'll just let it trace for the next 30 minutes. We'll put the SFTC dev console trace. Oh, and that changed. There we go. Okay, so now we're tracing this user, and when we update this to approved, we'll be able to see the log that gets generated. In order to do this also, if I want to see the logs here, I have to go into debug and uncheck that show my current logs only, because otherwise I won't see any logs that are for other users, and process automated process is a different user. So let us then update this to approved and save. So of course, if we go to the user, we should be able to see that the user is now a Jedi Knight. The same process builder has done that. If we go to our public group, we should be able to observe that the Luke is no longer in the Padawan group, but rather he is in the, Jedi Knight group. So here's our, here's our Padawan group, and it has no members. It had Luke Skywalker earlier, as we saw, and he is now in our Jedi Knight public group. Let's look at what that looked as the debug log. So here's platform event process, and here's platform event trigger. You see that both of them executed as automated process. This is our process builder that changed the role. This is our trigger that changed the group membership. Let's look at both of them. Here's a process builder. If you've ever seen how process builder debug logs look, you have all your flow stuff happening here. You can see all of your loop events, your assignments, all these other fun stuff. It's all here. However, we're more interested in this trigger, in this debug log that looks at the trigger. So what we can see is that we get all of these groups that we talked about. There's actually, I probably should have put some more debug statements in the code. I don't think I put enough. Yep, I definitely don't have enough, but we do have at least a couple. So let's maybe just look at these couple of debug statements and see what we see. Here's the group members. So we find, this is the map of maps, right? So for the first map, the outer map, the key Padawan has an internal map that has user ID 0053, and the group member is this guy. And then it has another user group ID. I'm sorry, this is the only, I'm sorry, this is the group member. This is the only ones we found, right? So this is one single record, ID, user group ID, and group ID. So there's one record inside our map. And then now we're iterating through it. This is the event that we're looking at first, the group remove. In group remove, we see this event, and now it's iterating through this group add and in group add. Those are all, we have this iterating. This is iterating over which platform event, and then inside. So we can see really that this system debug executed twice because we had, if you look at this line 39, we had two events, one to add and one to remove, but this one only executed once. Line 43 only showed up once because we only had one group add and we only had one group remove. So again, if we look at the log, line 39 executed twice, here and here, once for the first platform event, second for the second platform event, but 43 and 51 only executed once each as we got into this if statement. So, any questions about this process? I see some conversation, but it looks like you guys have been answering each other. So I appreciate that. And with that, let's go back to our presentation. So we're not actually going to look into this one in a lot of details. We'll just talk about it. This is something that I find extremely helpful. So one of the requirements here, Maggie is an architect, and she was tasked with designing a solution to handle multiple large volume transactions that have to occur when a role change is completed. So again, this is just completely hypothetical, but let's say when a role change is updated, we need to do a mass update for all the opportunities owned by the promoted user. We also need to then execute a process that recalculates commission payments for all of these opportunities, and then maybe we need to push these opportunities updates to the company's ERP. So the business does not want the second and the third task to be performed in sequence, but rather in parallel. So in other words, we want to first update all the opportunities, and then we want the second and the third activities to happen at exactly the same time or in parallel. So our challenge is that Salesforce only allows chaining one job at the end of an async process. So we know that to update a lot of opportunities, if we have, let's say, millions of opportunities, we said it's a large volume transaction, right? So let's say we have millions of opportunities in our environment. So typically when we want to update large volume records, we would use a batch. That's exactly what batches are designed for. However, in the finish method for a batch, we're only allowed to chain one other batch. We can't say, oh, when this batch is done, let's execute two more batches now in parallel. We could have this batch execute this batch, and in the finish method, execute this batch. However, that's not what Maggie was tasked with. So if we look at this just as a kind of a flow chart, we have a role change. The role change then executes this job that gets all the opportunities, gets all the users, distributes all the opportunities based on capacity. And when this is all done, we want to execute both of these two tasks at the same time. So how can we do this? This is a slightly more complex scenario. Let me close these logs. Maggie decided to leverage surprise platform events. So we said that platform events create a separate context. So if we publish a platform event at the end of this batch, it's no longer the same batch context. And what that means is you can actually launch multiple batches. It's as simple as that. So let's look at what we have. We have here our reparent batch. It's a very, very simple batch method. Oh, and let's go back to platform event and see this thing that Maggie created. So Maggie created this thing called launch async class. And this platform event has two simple fields on it. What class you want to launch and what batch size you want to execute. By the way, one of the things that I haven't shown you is that when you look at the platform event, you can actually see right from here who are the subscribers. So trigger is a subscriber, but it shows as triggers. But you can also see any process builder that fires off this. So this is always a very interesting thing. Right? At any platform event, you can see anything that listens to these platform events. However, let's go back to the developer console. And I'm sorry. Yeah, let's go back to the developer console. We have here our batch that gets executed. Every time this platform event, this reparenting needs to happen, the trigger could then execute or schedule this batch. And this patch does a bunch of different things. We don't really care right now what it does. It queries all the opportunities, it executes, and then for each opportunity, we don't actually do here, we have a system debug, do a bunch of stuff, do a bunch of other stuff, and then whatever. However, what's interesting is our finish method. So if I just try, let me comment out this section of code for a second. If I just try to enqueue 2 queuables, it doesn't even have to be 2 batches. Let's see if I have the code to execute this. Yep. So let me save this batch with those changes. If I try to launch this batch now, we'll see this batch was executed. Oh, it didn't save, I'm sorry. Yeah, I should have commented all the way up to here. Save. Okay, so again, if I try to execute it, we get this wonderful error, too many queuables added, jobs added to queue, 2. And that is because we can only chain 1 at the end of an async job. So to get around this error, again, we can simply comment out these 2 things, and we'll instead publish 2 events. So we have a list of events to publish. We create one event, called new event, and we give it a name, export changes to ERP queuable. And we have another event that's called recalc commission queuable. And here are those 2 queuables. They actually don't really do anything, but they're right here. And then on this platform event to publish, launch async class, we also have a trigger. Let me open that. Launch async class trigger. This is a really simple trigger, but it's really, really powerful. So for each event, as I go through here, for each event, I'm saying if the class name is not blank, because of course, if we have a class name, we can't do this. What I actually try to find out, this trigger actually can handle both queuables and batches. So I'm using the type class to identify if, first of all, I cast this event class name into a class type. So this allows me to instantiate this class based on the name of the class that was passed to me. And then I can, I define it as a type and then I instantiate it. And then I can say if the class instance is an instance of batchable, then do a database execute. And I can also use a ternary statement here to say if the event batch size is null, then set the default 200. Otherwise, pass in the batch size that was passed. So if somebody publishes the platform event and forgets to say what batch size should be, we'll use 200 by default. Otherwise, we'll just say the batch size is what the value that was passed. However, if it wasn't an instance, if it wasn't the class wasn't an instance of a batchable, if it's a instance of a queuable, then we need to use the system.enqueue job. So again, a really simple trigger that can take a name of a class and then either execute it or enqueue it based on what type of class it is. And if we do the same exact thing again, I can't really clear this without deleting them. So I'm just going to leave this. Let me just mark this as red so we can see where we started this execution again. So I'm going to run this batch again. And we can see that, oh, did I forget to save? I forgot to save it. Aren't I great? Let's try this one more time. So now that I run this, so we can see that we have our batch apex executing. We can also see we have 2 queuable handlers. One is going to be for the export changes to ERP, Here we go, export changes to ERP, and the other one is going to be for our recalc commission queuable. And of course, we have the trigger on the platform event. This may appear to be sometimes a little bit out of order, and that's just because they all executed so fast. If the batch actually had been doing something, you would see first the batch completed, then the event trigger, and then the queuable. But hopefully this was all clear. And again, feel free to look at this code. I'll share with you the link to the GitHub repo in a moment. So, couple more use cases. One of the great things about platform events is, so one of the limits in Salesforce, right? We know that with batches, we know we can only execute up to 5 batches at the same time. And if you have to do a lot of these kind of things that have to update a bunch of records, you might need to be very careful about how you execute your batches, when checking if the other batches are running and so on. And even with queuables, you know, you can only have up to 100 queuables in your flex queue at any given moment. So if you have a process that needs to execute something asynchronously very frequently, you need to be aware that if you try to schedule to enqueue more than 100 jobs in before the previous ones have been able to complete it, you'll get this error that says flex queue is full. You can't enqueue any more jobs. So one of the great things about platform events is, if you think about it, every platform event is really its own unique dedicated thread, right? In the Salesforce platform, we don't really have this concept of multi-threaded processing. However, by creating several platform events, you can actually have threads that are dedicated for a given task. So you can create a platform event that does X, a platform event that does Y. You can execute them. They can run in parallel. Keep in mind, they'll always execute in order. So in that way, they're almost like a batch. And by controlling the size of the execution of the trigger, you can actually create almost like an impromptu batch. You just need to keep in mind that each event you process only has the synchronous governor limits assigned to it. As I said, you can use this resume from replay ID. You can use that to have a trigger that executes in a very dynamic way, meaning, you know, maybe you can process some events, 100 of them, 2,000 of them in a single execution, but maybe in some other scenarios, you need to be able to run the same code, but stop the execution after 500 events. You can have it based on a number. You can have it based on using the limits class to know how much limits you've already consumed. The web service callouts from platform events, there's a little asterisk here, and that relates directly to the question that I can't remember who asked earlier. I'll talk about it in 1 second. And of course, you can create this reusable concept in separate context, right? So you can execute things that execute in a separate context, and you can leverage those platform events to reuse from many different places. So a perfect example is this launch async class or platform event that we just looked at, right? You could have many different processes that need to launch asynchronous code, and all of them can publish this one type of platform event, and this platform event then goes and executes or enqueues the jobs that need to use it. There's many other use cases. To be very candid, I've been using platform events extensively over the last year to solve many cool problems. But this is just kind of some thoughts to get you started. Now, the web services callouts from platform event, as I said, right now is something you cannot actually do. However, one of the last speakers in Apex Hours, Jitendra, actually, he and I had a conversation. He told me that he found a way around it. So the problem is, as I said, it's not that you cannot make a call out from a platform event. It's that the trigger framework does not allow you to make a call out. And the trigger framework doesn't care if it's a trigger on a nest object or a platform event. However, if you have a platform event with a process builder on it, so the listener is a process builder, that process builder can call an invocable Apex method, and that Apex method can then do a call out. So it's a kind of a tricky way to fool Salesforce. And my conversation with the product manager for platform event, he was telling me that this is something that definitely mean to resolve. Unfortunately, he's been promoted since then, and I haven't spoken to the new product manager. I'm hoping this is still on the product map. With that, some other resources. We're basically done with the presentation. So, I would absolutely recommend you take the trail mix, getting started with platform events. This will get you through all of the concepts we talked about today, plus some other things that we didn't get to touch about today. All of the source code we looked at today, including the metadata for the platform events and the objects, is all in this repository. This repository belongs to Roy Gilad. Roy Gilad is another Salesforce MVP, and we actually created this presentation originally for Dreamforce. So we presented this to Dreamforce, and it's his repo, so just credits where credits due. And of course, the platform events developer guide, phenomenal place to get deeper than the trail mix, right? The trail mix, as you know, Trailhead keeps it pretty high level. Developer guide will teach you a lot more about what you can and cannot do with platform events. And with that, I'd like to thank everybody and open the floor to any questions. We can unmute you. And let's see if some questions in the chat. Naresh asked, regarding Mixed DML, when we worked on Aura components, ran into Mixed DML, updating opportunity end user. We handled it on Aura by breaking the updates on each object into its own NQ actions. Is there a better way than this? Using platform or using platform events is better. Using PEs won't create additional component packaging hurdles if we created a managed package out of this. I think you're right. I think that using the multiple NQ actions options is less than ideal, because you're actually creating basically you're executing one thing and then you have to execute the other thing. With a platform event, you can literally just publish these two events and complete it. There's also a way to handle platform events publish. You can actually, an Aura or a Lightning components can actually listen to platform events. So you could actually have a user on a page with a Lightning component that maybe looks at a list of accounts that meet certain criteria, and somebody completely on the other side of the world on the same org just made a change on an account that made it met the criteria. You can have a trigger or possibly fire a platform, publish a platform event, and that Aura component could immediately find it, get it, and update that list to include that account now without the user needing to refresh or to do anything. There is actually a Salesforce pilot. I can't remember exactly the name of it. I think it's called Live Records or something like that. And Live Records are exactly that. You could have like an account page, and using CDC, Change Data Capture, you can then have the account record page update in real time when somebody else updates the record. So that is actually using the exact same concept I've just discussed, or just described. You have a component that listens to a platform event. In this case, it's the CDC platform event, and it updates the page immediately without the need to refresh. Chandra says, for the equivalent set of tasks, are there any cost comparisons available, meaning using platform events versus async versus sync? So Synchronous, I think Synchronous is always what we lean towards as it's best to do it synchronously, because that gives us the best user experience and we complete the transaction, we complete all the work we need to do. However, there are some scenarios that even if you can accomplish synchronously something, if it doesn't immediately impact what the user sees, it might make sense to break it, because even the saving operation can take less time. So, it's really up to you to kind of decide, oh, this is a scenario where I could leverage platform events to accomplish a better user experience, or just to break some of my logic. And then, I've talked a lot about the difference between using platform events versus async, right? You get a dedicated thread, so you can do things without consuming your queuable queue, without relying on that, whenever the system resources are available, or without having the limit of 5 batches at the same time. Live Records is correct, Amy says, but I think it's Lightning. Yes, it absolutely is Lightning experience specific, because it does rely on Lightning components. Absolutely. With platform events, are there any additional components packaging hurdles if we create a managed package with platform events? So I would say, I don't think there are specific hurdles about packaging platform events, even though I did have a conversation with another technical architect who told me that he did have some challenge with packaging the platform event. I can't remember right now what it was. However, there is one thing really, really important, specifically for ISVs. you need to understand that as an ISV, if you use platform events, you're actually using an org-wide limit. So there's no, let's look at here. There's no limits for specifically for the package, right? So if you are using, let's say, platform events to do something that creates a lot of events, you could consume a significant amount of how many events the user can, the customer can use. And if they're already using platform events, or they have another managed package that uses platform events for doing a lot of other things and publishing, you may get into a scenario where you exceed the limits of how many events you're allowed to publish. So as an ISV, you have to be really cognizant of doing this. You need to be aware that you're telling your customers that you're doing that, that you're aware that you're sharing an org-wide limit and not a package-specific limits. And so this is the standard event, high-volume platform event. So as I said, you can see that with standard events, you can only have up to 100 events. You can only, Comet D is the technology that uses external integration. You can have up to 2,000 subscribers, or 1,000 in an enterprise org, 2,000 in performance or unlimited. You can only have up to 4,000 processes that subscribe to events, to a single platform event. And you can only, number of active processes that subscribe to a platform event, 2,000. So you can have, I guess, 4,000, but only 2,000 of them can be active. However, with high volume platform event, let's see what this says, default allocation. So maximum number of events delivered. So to external consumers, Comet D clients, meaning outside of the platform, you can only deliver 25,000 events externally in a 24-hour period. For internal number of events, you can do 250,000 events per hour. So it's a lot of events you can publish in a given hour, but you still need to be aware that there is a limit, right? And so as an ISV, again, you just need to be aware that you're using this limit in your customer's org, and depending on what they're doing, they may already be consuming a significant amount. You could actually purchase additional licensing, so you could increase both of this and this number. However, that's a paid license. From my experience, it's not an extremely expensive license. However, I can't share any pricing. You'd have to work with an AE, account executive, to get those pricing. Any other questions? Yeah, this is, by the way, standard platform event allocation. You could have only published 100,000 in an hour. And so high volume are obviously better. And that's why standard provide no benefit. So they were sunsetted.
So I just unmute everyone. So just in case anybody have a question, feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question directly.
Okay, any other questions? I see Naresh posted with PEs. Are there any comparison with platform events? Oh, great presentation. One last thing. So process builder process is always debugging using process user. It only debugs using automated process user if it's a platform event process, if the process builder is active on a platform event. If it's on a process builder on a standard S object, it always debugs as the current user that updated the record. And SFDC Schwabe said that he really loved this presentation. I appreciate that. I really loved giving this presentation. Okay, I will say one question. I'm sorry?
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. One last question from me, if we are close.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, so I think we did not speak about its backward compatibility with Classic. Can I have a statement from you on that?
Yeah, absolutely. What do you want to know? It's just, is it backward compatible with Classic?
Yeah, any use cases that you have worked on, or any experience, like any problems with that?
Absolutely not. So platform events are platform level. It has nothing to do with UI and UX. Yeah. So with the exception of that ability to use platform events to update Lightning components, that's the only use case where a platform event could be used to impact UI. But for any processing, somebody has, I'm going to mute. Okay, thank you. For any
Hello?
processing, there's no difference whether you're on platform on classic or Lightning experience.
Oh, done. Yeah, this is Bala. Hello.
Hi, Bala.
Hello. Yeah, I have a doubt on that PDF generation. Can we do in LWC?
Say it again.
Can we do the PDF generation in LWC Lightning Web Component?
PDF generation?
Yeah.
I mean, keep in mind, if you can execute a platform event, the platform event can then generate a PDF and store it or do whatever you want with it, right? But you'd need to somehow communicate it back to your Lightning Web Component, right? So you'd probably want to save it as a file and then have your Lightning Web Component access that file, for example. So you could have the Lightning Web Component, maybe you click the button that says generate PDF, and then that publishes an event. The event will then generate a PDF, save it as a file, and maybe when it's done saving the file, it will publish another platform event to let the Lightning Web Component that know that the file has been created and it should refresh and query it and present it. So I don't know if that's exactly what you had in mind, but you know, that's something you could do.
Okay, Vad, this is really great demo and really great topic, like lots of new learning. And I personally like the demo, how you explain that in a very easy way. It's really
Thank you.
It's really nice and lots of new learning. Thank you, and also thank you everyone for joining us on the Saturday, and we will be come back with the next topic on next Saturday.
Amit, before you let everybody go, just one more thing. If you do need to reach me, I don't think I put it on the presentation, sorry. But if I didn't, let me just show it on this. God damn it, sorry. I don't know if I did include that, but if I did not, let me just put it right here, right now. You can always reach out to me on Twitter at ohad. And I'm always happy to answer any questions. Reach out to me publicly or through a private message. I'm always happy to answer questions if I can.